for joining us today for our Students, Stress, and MBTI Type webinar. My name is Anjane Wright, and I'm the Associate Marketing Manager here at CPP. I'll be moderating today's webinar. Today we have 614 registered attendees. Before we begin, I'd like to take a quick walkthrough of the webinar format. Today's webinar will run for 90 minutes, and during the presentation, if you have any questions, please submit them to me using the question function in the webinar controls. Patrick will be pausing throughout the webinar today to answer your questions. 2 reps from CPP's education team are also in attendance, Jim Larkin and Jack Powers, and they'll be available to answer questions as well. As with all our webinars, today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll be sending out a link to the recording in the next few days. Please note that the PowerPoint slides are not available for our Ask an Expert series. As promised, we are doing another Twitter contest because everyone seems to love these mugs. We want everyone to have a chance to win one since they are limited and are only available with a purchase. The top 10 tweeters will win. Here are the rules. So follow us at CPP Education and use hashtag CPPAAE in all of your tweets. This is how we'll track your tweets. Share relevant and quality content and have fun. The contest will end today at 1 p.m. Pacific Time and 4 p.m. Eastern Time. The winners will be announced through Twitter when Karen gets back on Monday. So that's it, simple enough. So now I'm very happy to welcome our CPP expert, Patrick Kerwin. He's owner of Kerwin & Associates in San Diego. For over 20 years, Patrick has used the MBTI instrument to develop individuals, teams, and organizations in educational, for-profit, and nonprofit institutions. Patrick is an MBTI master practitioner, a national certified counselor, and also one of a small cadre of faculty who conducts the MBTI certification program. Patrick is a recognized expert in the application of the MBTI instrument to a variety of topics, including stress, team building, career development, leadership, change, and conflict. He is the author of several MBTI training guides as well, and the author of Kerwin Value Survey Career Values Assessment, and the just-released book, True Type Tales, Real Stories About the Power of Personality Type in Everyday Life. So please join me in welcoming Patrick, and I'd like to turn it over to the webinar to him. Thanks, Patrick.
Ajay, thank you for that very nice welcome. And hello to all of you, wherever you are. I want to start off by just letting you know that I'm getting over a little cold, so I may be periodically coughing, or even better yet for a webinar, clearing my throat like that. So I'll try to minimize that as much as I can. So as Ajay mentioned, I've used the Myers-Briggs for 22 years now. And when I started off using the Myers-Briggs instrument, I was using it back when I was doing career counseling. So I was doing career counseling in my private practice, and I was doing career counseling at Santa Monica College, and also teaching career planning classes at Santa Monica College. So shout out to my friends at SMC. So when I first started using it, I didn't talk about stress very often because I was still trying to wrap my head around these 8 letters. What did they mean? How could we use them? I was trying to understand more about my type and what were these other 15 types that were out there, and trying to keep it kind of focused on that. But regardless of what I want to do, my clients and students regularly brought up the topic of stress. So they would say, yes, this is my type, but when I'm under stress, I do something different. I do go over here. So we started having more conversations about type and stress. And I started reading more about it, and I was taking my own stress reactions. I was starting to learn more about the stress reactions of people whose types I knew. And so before I knew it, I found myself talking about stress pretty comfortably and pretty regularly. And then 6 years ago, I got my first request to actually do a type and stress workshop. I had done other workshops on my own, but this was the first one to do in a leadership program, and it was a group of physicians in particular. And so right away, this totally stressed me out because I thought, what am I going to tell a group of physicians about type and stress that they don't already know? And so my first stress reaction was to try and get a medical degree online. That did not prove to be successful, so then my second strategy was to read more about type and stress, go back to my own material, my own research on type and stress, and I realized that actually I knew more than I realized I knew. So I did the workshop, half-day workshop, and it was great. But it didn't seem great in the beginning. So about an hour into the workshop, there was this one doctor, and I remember he was an ENTP, and he got up and he went to the back of this room. He started pacing back and forth. There were about 40 people in this workshop. And he's pacing back and forth. And I'm thinking, oh, wow, when an ENTP starts pacing back and forth, that just can't be a good thing. And so then I started asking the group questions about, their own stress examples, and people really weren't talking. And by the way, I have preferences for ENFJ. So when you're an ENFJ, making a connection with your group, hearing them laugh, hearing them interact is really important. That's why webinars are just great for an ENFJ, by the way. So anyway, so I'm asking these questions, and I'm not getting a lot back. And so I thought, okay, my other stress reactions at ENFJ is to start to think that everything's a disaster. This is really not good. And so I called a break because I needed a break. And as soon as I called the break, that ENTP doctor shot up to the front of the room, and he's like, I've been back there, and I've been thinking about my stress reactions when I had a practice with this other doctor, and what I used to do is exactly what you've been talking about with type and stress. And I think I know this other doctor's type, and I think he reacted exactly in the way that his type would. So he was really figuring that out. And then he left, and then there was a line of people behind him, a lot of people that weren't talking in the workshop, who came up to talk to me about their stories and how they were thinking about work or home. So, it always really amazes me how people really get it. A couple months ago, I had one of my best friends has a daughter who just started at San Diego State in the fall. A couple months ago, I had her daughter and her daughter's roommate over for dinner and to take the Myers-Briggs because they wanted to take it. So they took the Myers-Briggs, and we talked about it. They found it pretty useful. And then over dinner, we started talking about type and stress because these are the things I talk about at dinner. And so I was asking them, like, what are some examples of what happens to you under stress? What kind of stresses you out? Wasn't trying to game it in any way. We didn't really talk about type specifically.
Patrick?
And as they gave it, hello?
Hey, Patrick, do you mind speaking up? We're getting a lot of feedback that you're very low.
Oh, I'm okay. How's that? Is that better?
Yeah, it sounds better. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. So as we talked about type and stress, their reactions really seem to match pretty closely to stress, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So it just seems that people seem to really get this type and stress information. Now, when you're using type and stress, the thing is it can get really complicated really quickly. So you've got to think about a couple things. You've got to think about, first of all, what's your comfort level with type and your level of knowledge with type, and then also what's your comfort level and knowledge of type of your students or your clients. And so the good news about type and stress, though, is that there are a variety of tips and techniques you can use with different levels of knowledge. So what I want to do today is kind of give you a sampler platter of different tips and techniques you can use, whether you want to just use them with the 8 letters, whether you want to look at the function pairs, which are the 2 middle letters, or whether you want to get into type dynamics. So specifically for our objectives today, we're going to start off by looking at type-specific ways to avoid getting stressed out. This is a real common thing people want to know, is how do you avoid this? We'll discover some common stress triggers by type. We'll explore what happens to different types when they're stressed. We'll examine some real-life student stories of stress events and how they connect to type. And then we'll review at the very end how to best support different types when they're under stress. Okay, so let's think about this. Spring is in the air. Now, I should say, I realize that spring apparently is not in the air everywhere. My sister lives in Minneapolis. It snowed there yesterday. I know in the Carolinas it was in the 30s this morning, so I know technically it's true. So let's just say that spring is going to be in the air, and soon, on college campuses everywhere, the trees will be sprouting new leaves and flowers will be blooming, and this can seem like a wonderful time of the year, especially after the winter that many people had. But for students, this is not necessarily the greatest time of the year because a lot of stuff starts piling up in the spring. So you might have the thought of final exams coming up. And then you have all these classes that you have to think about. And then you got to start studying for all these classes. And then, oh my gosh, I have a lot to do. Oh, by the way, I have to think about graduation. And oh, wow, there's the interviewer coming to shake my hand. I got to think about interviews and jobs. And then, oh yeah, I got to move out of my dorm or apartment and either move back in with my parents or find a place to live. So all this stuff starts to really pile up. And it really is a ripe time of the year for stress events to happen. So let's take a look at some ways that we can use type to work with stress. One of the questions I hear a lot working with stress is, how do I avoid getting stressed out? A lot of times these stress reactions that we have are pretty horrifying because we're not our best selves. They can be very embarrassing to people. That's part of the reason why in that workshop I mentioned earlier, people weren't saying a lot. That's really common in stress workshops because these reactions that we have can be embarrassing and pretty personal. So people often want to know, how can they avoid it? We'll look a little later on in the webinar that actually stress events can't be avoided. So our psyches are self-regulating, and so there's always information trying to come at us to let us know if we're out of balance or not. So we'll talk more about that later. But there are some things you can do to at least try to minimize your stress reactions. And the real key element here is to be mindful, which sounds so basic, but it actually is the key element to using type, is to really be mindful of how much are you using your 4 preferences, how much are you using your opposite 4 preferences, and just really tracking yourself as you go through your day-to-day life. This is a real tricky one because our temptation and kind of our natural gravitational pull is to slip into our groove of our 4 letters. And so we have to really try to think about being very aware of how we're using our preferences and our opposites. Now, to minimize getting stressed out, we can actually use the 8 individual preferences to give us some information, to give us a few techniques. So if you have a preference for E and you're doing a lot of extroverting, that can really lead you to getting stressed out. So let's say you're having to do a lot of studying alone, you're having to do so much studying that you're not able to socialize as much as you normally would. So to try to kind of minimize getting stressed out, if your student has a preference for E and you're doing lots of introverting, is try to find a way to do some socializing, find talk to, or even find an active place to hang out, even if it's only for a little bit of time. I remember this in college. I have a preference for E. My roommate had a preference for I. We lived in this very small apartment, and we had our 2 desks that were on opposite sides of the room. And when it came time to studying, he was really good at sitting at his desk and being really focused, and it was a really quiet place to study, and that really worked for him. I would sit across the room, and it was too quiet for me, and so I would either start distracting him or trying to find something else to do. And finally, what I started doing is going to the library, which sounds like that would be a very introverted place, but libraries, like a lot of places, have their introverted pocket and their extroverted pocket. I happened to find an extroverted pocket, which is a place where there was a lot of foot traffic back and forth, so there was a lot of outer activity going on that just really helped me get my studying done. Now, conversely, if you have a preference for I and you're doing a lot of extroverting, so let's say you're having to do a lot of group projects as a student, or you're having to do a lot of interviewing, so you're interacting with a lot of people every day. Try to excuse yourself, find a quiet place to go, take a solitary walk, go for a drive. Just try to carve out a little bit of introverted time for yourself in this very extroverted world. I find this even in my work now. I work with a lot of physicians, and their work is very extroverted. And for eyes, this can be so draining for them that we have to figure out little ways where they can literally escape and go find some time to introvert. Let's go to the next set of preferences, sensing, intuition. So if you have a preference for sensing and you're having to do a lot of intuition kind of activities, so let's say you're having to do a lot of theme papers or you're having to think a lot about the future or the unknown. Those are all N things. Try to do something that has tangible results, like put something away, finish a task, do something physical, something that actually engages your senses so that you can kind of get back to that core part of yourself. My friend's daughter I mentioned that goes to San Diego State, when we were talking about one of her classes that was kind of provoking some stress, one of them was English, and she has a preference for sensing. And when she first started talking to me about the class, she said, well, the problem is I write like a third grader. She said, when I read a book, I write about the book and report back what the book was actually about. And she said, and my teacher keeps wanting me to expound on my thoughts and make connections and relate it to other topics or other world events. And she just doesn't go there that naturally. Now, she needs to be successful in this class, and of course she can do this kind of intuition activity. But for her, she's going to need to take some breaks along the way to kind of keep in touch with that sensing part of herself. All right, the other side is if you have a preference for intuition and you're doing lots of detailed sensing activities, like let's say you're having to track a lot of interviewing data, or you're having to keep your kind of nose to the grindstone, you're in triage mode where you have to focus on one thing at a time very precisely. Try to take some time to do something that uses your imagination, like drawing, brainstorming, journaling, something that really engages your intuition. I had an example of this a few months ago. I was revising a binder for a train-the-trainer program I offer on team building. And so I had added new content, which then changed the pagination of the whole binder. So I had to go through this, 180-page binder and make sure that all the page references were correct, that all the topics that related to other topics were still referenced properly. So it was about 4 hours staring at my computer screen and doing this incredibly precise work. And then I took a break to have lunch, and I was on my deck, and I thought to myself, well, what is today? And I thought, I have no idea. And then I thought, well, what is today's date? And I thought, I have no idea. And what happened is I've been doing so much sensing work, I literally drained all of my energy out of being able to even take in even basic sensing information. And so what I did is I actually took a break because I thought, I can't keep doing this, obviously. My first thought was actually, so this is how it begins. But what I really realized was that it was my sensing function. I was overdoing sensing. And so I took a little break, and there was a remodeling project I wanted to do in my house. And so I just did some visualizing of what this could look like and what I wanted this to look like. And that really helped me kind of get back to normal. And what it really taught me is I can't do those long stretches of sensing. It's just too draining. Okay, if you have a preference for T, now getting into T and F, and you're doing lots of personal feeling activities, a lot of that can really come up at the end of the year. There's a lot of relationship recalibrating that happens for students as they start to, if they're graduating, to start thinking about what's happening to my relationship. Friends can start to get sad about the end of the year coming, so there can be lots of emotional kinds of things that start coming up for people. And if you're a T, just make sure and take some time to do something analytical, solving a problem, logically organizing a paper or project, something that engages your T so that you can get a break from these intense personal feeling activities. Now, if you have a preference for F and you're doing a lot of logical T activities, so maybe you're having to work on a lot of analytical projects, in that case, take some time to do something meaningful for you, like whatever it is, reflecting on what's important to you, connecting with a close friend, anything that actually makes you feel good will be important for Fs. Okay, getting into the J and the P now. So if you have a preference for J and you're doing a lot of open-ended proceeding activities, interviewing is a great example on this one because when you're interviewing, you might send out your resume or even go on an interview, and then there's like this black hole where you don't know what's happening and you haven't heard from people, and there are these lapses of time and things aren't under your control. It can be kind of disorienting for Js. So if you're doing a lot of open-ended P things, identify some undone tasks that you actually do have control over. Make a plan to get it done and get started on it. Okay, so just take some kind of activity that you can control. Now, if you have a preference for P and you're doing a lot of structured J activities, like you're having to schedule interviews, you're having to plan your graduation requirements, make sure that everything is ordered for graduation. Try to find simple ways that you can off-road from the structure. Take a different route home, make an unscheduled stop on the way to class, something that allows you to kind of do something out of the ordinary that can feed your perceiving preference. So when you're working with students, if you're working with students that know the 8 letters, these are some really, really foundational ways that people can use type to really think about how they can try to minimize stress, how they can track what kinds of activities they're working on, to be able to use type language to match to those activities and say, you know, am I overdoing a particular preference? Now, we talked earlier about all these different things that can pile up in the springtime for students. One of the ones that provokes a lot of stress in particular is this one here. And it's, I need a job, or I need an internship. And that's kind of the feeling that people have when they're faced with that. So we can really help out in that kind of stressful situation by being really cognizant of the kind of career guidance that we offer students. And I'll give you an example. I'm going to get rid of Macaulay called from there. I'll give you an example. When years back, I used to teach at the University of San Diego in their graduate counseling program, and I taught the internship program, so my students were out doing interning, a lot of them doing career counseling. I remember there was one of my students who came in one day and said, when I'm working with students, I tell every single student, here was the one approach, tell every single student to talk to as many people as you can. And he said, because you'll gain lots of useful information. And you'll build relationships, which will be useful for your career plan. Now, you know, this sounds like really solid, sage advice to give to someone. But the question is, it's great if you have preferences for E, right? Talk to as many people as you can. Okay, for E, this is a great technique. S, because you'll gain lots of useful information. This is wonderful if you have a preference for sensing. F, and you'll build relationships. Well, what could be better than building relationships when you have a preference for F? And J, it'll be useful for your career plan. Okay, planning is good when you have a preference for J. But what happens if you have preferences for I, or N, or T, and or P? Well, there he is again. So if you have preferences for INTP, the thought of doing those things, of going out and immediately talking to people and getting really specific information and doing relationship building and planning is kind of the exact opposite of what your type is wired to do. So while INTPs, or people that have preferences for I or N or T and P, can do tasks that are associated with their opposite preferences, we're usually a little resistant or reluctant to do those things first. So when we're trying to support students as they go through looking for a job or an internship, we want to encourage them to really get started with their 4 preferences. So for example, for people that do have a preference for E, absolutely. So start networking. Talk to lots of people about your job search. This is a great way to start and actually will probably really ignite your job search when you have a preference for E. But if you have a preference for I, the technique's a little different. Is you probably want to just start off by not talking to a lot of people and start researching. Talking to just a few trusted sources that you have so that you can kind of get your inner thoughts together first before you start going out and extroverting and talking to people. Now, if you have a preference for sensing, you can start with some sensing information. What skills and experience have you accumulated? What are some specific questions to ask during the interviews? This will be a really good way to get you started. For N's, probably a better place to start is to brainstorm job options. Visualize what your future job could look like. You know, this is where the question, if you could do anything you wanted to do, what would it be? So it's a very great end question to ask. For T's, so as you start to engage in your job search, is to look at the logical way to approach it. What are pros and cons of varying techniques? Look for problem spots. What could happen? What could possibly go wrong if I do this plan versus if I do this option? What could go wrong? If you have a preference for F, you probably want to start your job search by starting off with something that feels right. Check in with your support system. Identify search techniques that you like. What do other people think about some of the search techniques you're thinking about? And then if you have a preference for J, yep, come up with a plan for moving your job search forward. Identify ways of tracking your progress. And if you have a preference for P, you know, just start with one of your options. Could be any one, see where it goes. So when you're trying to minimize stress, even in getting started on the job search, helping your students think about their 8 letters is a good place to start. Now, it's not the ending point, by the way. So we know that all 8 of these preferences have a role to play in job search. And so if you have a preference for, let's say, preferences for E and FP, probably going to be good to get you started by going out, talking to people, engaging your E, you know, using your N and brainstorming, using your F, seeing what feels right, and using your P and letting you be really spontaneous and fluid. But at some point, we're probably also going to want to encourage you to engage your I, to really step back, reflect, go inside. We probably want you to engage your sensing at some point, to look at the realities of the job. Probably want you to engage your T to see, you know, is there anything wrong with some of these choices? And we probably want you to engage your J at some point to kind of put some kind of loose plan together to move forward. But to get you started, we want to get you started with your main 4 preferences. All right, so once you get started on the job seeking process, the next thing that happens is that the interview gets lined up. And with the interviews can provoke jitters in any of the different types for different reasons. And what I want to move on to next is to move on from the 8 letters and to move into the function pairs. And for those of you that have been in Judy Gruder's webinar, you've heard about the function pairs. They're the 2 middle letters. And she refers to these as the heart of type. So the 2 middle letters in your personality are really the core of personality. And they can get a little bit rattled when we're under stress. So let's look at how to handle the ST pre-interview jitters. And if you're working with ST students who are preparing for interviews. Some of the jitters that STs have are worrying that they won't have enough specific information about the role or organization or about how things get done there. We have to remember that for STs, accuracy, precision, getting things done properly is usually the draw of that personality. So worrying that they won't have enough specificity, they won't have precision, can make them get stressed out. Now, there are ways to talk them down. So when STs start to go in that direction, encourage them to just do a quick review of all the research they've done and all the specific information they've gathered. So sometimes STs forget all that they've done, all that they do know, and they can get focused on what they don't know. You also want to remind them that they aren't expected to know every single bit of information, and to really instead try to focus on asking questions about the things they don't know. And then encourage them to come up with a question or two about something that's causing them anxiety. So I was working with someone once, an ST, who was thinking about interviewing, and he said, you know, what really stresses me out is I'm just worried that when I get in there and I start being in the interview, I'm not going to be familiar with all the ways that they get things done in this organization. Well, we couldn't know all the ways they get things done in that organization, so instead we came up with a few really specific questions that he wanted to know. So rather than looking unprepared, he went in actually looking very prepared with these questions to find out that kind of information. All right, so if you have the two middle letters of SF, there are some slightly different pre-interview jitters. And this is, SFs will often worry that they'll say something incorrect or that they'll embarrass themselves. SFs really like to get things right so they can be helpful and so that they can relate to other people, and they worry that they may get something wrong that will either harm someone else or make them be embarrassed. So with SF, talking them down, you want to encourage them to remember, again, all the preparation they've done and all the information that they've accumulated to really get things right and to be helpful, because for SF, being helpful is a real hallmark of that personality. Encourage them to think of a time or two when they received positive feedback for getting something done right and for being helpful. So when they start to worry about, I might screw this up, I might say something wrong, remind them of all the times they've said something right where they've had their information correct and it really has been helpful to another person. And reassure them that they know their stuff and that they have a lot to offer others. And you probably want to be specific about know their stuff. You want to be specific about what they actually do know and all of the information and experience they have. All right, let's look at some NFs here and handling NF pre-interview jitters. With NFs, they'll often worry that they won't make a connection with the interviewer, or worse yet, that the interviewer won't like them, or sometimes NFs will jump ahead to how they'll feel if they don't get the job. Their N starts to think about the future very quickly. So for NFs, the big pull in the personality is they want to connect with people. And when they're in an interview and they feel like they're not connecting or that someone isn't relating to them, that can be a real concern. So what we want to do to help talk them down is, first of all, encourage them, I should say remind them of their ability to read people and their knack for adjusting to the style of others. So NFs typically will say that they have this ability to kind of, get a sense for people, and then when they figure someone else out, they can kind of modify their own style. So remind them of their ability to do that. Also, this is a really important one, remind them that not all interviewers need to build a relationship with them, and that if it looks like an interviewer isn't building a relationship, it doesn't necessarily mean the interviewer doesn't like them. The interviewer just may find them really competent, but doesn't have a need to build a long-lasting life friendship with them in that moment. And encourage them to be their most authentic self in the interview. You all often hear in interviews, or people who are going into interviews here, just be yourself. And of all the different function pairs, for this particular function pair, that really makes the most sense, because for NFs, that authenticity is really the most important thing for them. All right, if you're working with NT students who are having some pre-interview jitters, for NTs, they'll often worry that they won't be viewed as competent or that they're not going to be able to perform at the top of their game when they're interviewing. So for NTs, the pull of the personality is toward demonstrating competence, and it's really sort of intellectual competence in particular. All different types care about competence, but for NTs, this intellectual competence is really essential. So if you've got NTs who are having those jitters, encourage them to review their achievements and of their ability to analyze complex topics. Encourage them to identify 2 or 3 significant examples of their competence that they can present in the interview whether or not they're asked. So if they're worried about coming off as competent in an interview where maybe they're a little shaky in that area, just making sure they have 2 or 3 examples of competence they can hang on to and present will give them a little bit of comfort. And then encourage them to look at the interview as a challenge and a problem to solve. This is what NTs usually like about dealing with people, dealing with situations, is the complexity and how they can find this solution to the problem. So encourage them to view interviews as a problem to solve. So those are some ways to use the function pairs to help students. So now would be a good time to take some questions. So Anjane, are there any questions?
Yes, Patrick, we have 2 questions so far. The first one is, You talked about ways to avoid getting stressed out when we spend lots of time in our opposite preferences. I'm wondering what happens when we spend lots and lots of time in our preferences and not much in our opposites.
Yeah, so when we kind of overdo our preferences. Yeah, so this is kind of, we could do a whole day workshop on type and stress because there are so many different applications of this. So we talked earlier about what happens if you're spending time outside of your preference. The other thing that can cause stress is if you start to overdo your preferences. Okay, so if you have a preference for E and you start to over extrovert, this is not always an effective way to live. And Jung's theory actually has kind of this balancing mechanism in place that talks about if you have a preference for E, you also need to spend some time introverting. So over extroverting can actually cause stress. Those of you that have a preference for E can think of times where you've done so much extroverting, and in the beginning it was energizing, but then it became completely exhausting, and then what you probably did is like ricocheted over to introversion and just wanted to get away from everything. It's because you overdid extroversion. And when we're to keep ourselves out of stress, we need to be spending some of our time, most of our time in our favorite place, and then some of our time in our opposite preference. So when you're in E, spending time in introversion is really essential so that you can gather information and get the benefit of your introverted thoughts and reflections. Sort of the flip side of that is if you have a preference for I and you over-introvert. So you might start off doing a lot of introverted activities, and that might be a really energizing place to be, but then you spend so much time introverting, it's kind of like falling down the rabbit hole, and that can then get very stressful. So for I's, it's important to keep some connection to the extroverted world and gathering the benefit of extroverted input and ideas.
Okay, great. Thanks, Patrick. We have a few more questions. Could you address any tips for dealing with students in groups when best fit type is not necessarily known? In other words, if you have 30 minutes with a large group, how can you best help talk them down from their various and possibly unknown ledges?
Okay. So the question is, if you're working with students who don't have a best fit type, how to best get to a best fit type? Is that accurate? Okay. Well, 30 minutes is pretty ambitious, is the first thing I would say, to kind of achieve the goal. With getting to best fit type, I just got this question actually from someone this week about how to help people get to best fit type. And I tend to let the activities that you do around type do the heavy lifting. So if someone isn't sure, I'll give you a great example. So I did a workshop at Notre Dame a couple of years ago for their, it was last year, for their counseling staff. And there was a person in the group, she couldn't figure out if she had a preference for sensing or intuition. And so we showed a picture that is part of the certification program, actually, and it's a picture of a sort of an adapted nursery rhyme, and it has a picture of looks like a puppet master in the middle. Those of you that have done the certification program will know this picture. And so you show it to a group of S's and you show it to a group of N's, and then you ask them to discuss the picture. And she thought she had a preference for intuition, and she was with the sensing group, and she started saying things like, well, you know, it really is a commentary on Isaac Newton's theory of relativity and all of his body of work that he did over the years. And she started talking about all these very connective kinds of ideas. And I could tell that the sensing group was just kind of looking at her like, what are you talking about? It is a man, there are two puppets, there's a fish, there's a butterfly. And so what I did is I kind of, you know, asked the group, I said, how is this for you as a group of sensing types? Like, what are you hearing? And they said, we are not hearing sensing at all. So I had her move over to the N group, and the N group, of course, like welcomed her with open arms because she was speaking their language. So I know it's hard to do, but I think, you know, using type, one of the challenges is I don't think you can really get through helping someone get to their best fit type in half an hour. It takes time. You know, that sensing intuition activity on its own can take time. But I think that's one technique, is to use let the activities kind of, again, do the heavy lifting.
Okay, our next question is, you mentioned several times, specifically with NTs, to focus on examples of competence and abilities. So what do you do if their types and abilities don't match up well? The example is if NTs who are not good at solving complex tasks.
So if you have an NT that's not good at solving complex tasks.
Yeah, so if their types and abilities don't match up.
I'm just trying to think of an NT that wasn't really drawn toward solving complex tasks. I guess, I would have questions for that person, to be quite honest with you. I mean, I'd want to know sort of what were their experiences. Have they had the opportunity to really express their NT preferences either in their life, in their schooling, in their work? Sometimes what can happen is people, there's a whole topic of type development, and what the theory says is that typically in the first half of life we really focus on especially those two middle letters and really getting comfortable with those and using them a lot, and that in the, quote, second half of life we start to take a greater interest in our opposite two letters and using them with more comfort. But the trick with that is that not everyone gets the support or the opportunity to develop their two middle letters early in life. So just this week I did an interpretation for a guy, a senior guy in a company, and he had preferences for INFP. So it's an NF, and he's in this very technical software company, and he became a programmer and was doing coding and all these kinds of things, which when you look at it from a type perspective was very ST, and he had done very ST work for a very long time. And now he was in his mid to late 40s, and he reports INFP and says, this is who I've always been. And I asked him, I said, how do you really express your NF, because you've been doing so much ST work? Because I said, a lot of times INFPs are kind of the counselor type. And he said, I can't believe you said that, because I am just starting to get into doing on the side, doing coaching. I'm involved in a coaching program because I want to develop that part of myself. It's just like this pull. So sometimes what happens is he grew up in a family and from a culture that didn't make going into counseling okay. But now he's a grown-up and he can make his own choices, and so he's kind of catching up with himself later in life. So if you've got an NT who doesn't have the skill developed in that area, I'd want to know things like, have they had opportunity to develop skill in that area? You have to look at their interests as well to see, have they been working on topics of interest where they can naturally use their NT self. So maybe their interest focus has been off of from what they're interested in. So I would have more questions to ask that person.
Okay, great. And this is just a reminder to attendees that you can submit questions through the question function in the webinar controls panel. So the next question is, what do you advise to do if you have people who are interns and love what they are doing, but the supervisor is the opposite MBTI type and shakes up the student's confidence in their major or career choice?
And what happens? That the supervisor does what?
The supervisor shakes up the student's confidence in their major or career choice.
Oh, that sounds great. Let's see. Well, first of all, I'd want the supervisor to know type, and because otherwise it's hard to use type with people that don't speak the language. Everybody's got to be kind of on the same page. So if that person doesn't know the Myers-Briggs, I would really encourage them to take a look at the Myers-Briggs and to take the instrument and encourage them that they could use it, to be more effective, efficient, whatever it is in their role. And once they've taken it, is then to have a conversation about how they can use that, how they can best support students. If they already know the Myers-Briggs, I would have that conversation. I mean, to tell you the truth, it sounds like it's almost like a team building workshop to me, is where you'd want to get people in the same room and using type to have a conversation about what's working well and what's not. It could be an example of I'm just going to use a TF example. It could be a T who is pointing out what might go wrong or what could be wrong in a student's career choice, not to derail the student, but to actually help them make a better decision and to really make sure they're kind of challenging their choices. That's how T's show they help you, is by helping you solve problems and make sure you're not overlooking things. The other thing I would want to check in on is for the person to ask a question, is on your own type, because sometimes if you have a preference for F, it can kind of look like someone is criticizing another person or derailing that person, when really all the people involved are just fine. An example I often use in that is a workshop I did in Chicago many years ago, and we were doing a TF activity, and the T's were, some of the T's in their group when they were doing the activity were kind of going back and forth with each other. And when we debriefed it, one of the T's said to another T, you know, I didn't find your style very effective. It just seemed like you were trying to poke holes in our process and kind of just take us off tack, and you were trying to be kind of provocative. And I just want to let you know, I don't think it was very effective. And I, as an F, had this initial reaction of intervention is required, right? So I wanted to kind of jump in there and make sure everybody was okay, but I caught myself as an F. And so I looked at those two T's, and I said to the one, I'm like, how are you doing? She's like, I'm fine. And I looked at the guy she'd given the feedback to, and I said, how are you doing? And he said, I'm fine. How are you? And then I went to the F's, and I'm like, how are you doing? And they're like, oh, my gosh, we just want to jump in and, you know, make sure things are okay. So we also kind of wanted, I just would want you to check in with yourself. I don't know if the person asking the question has a preference for T or F, but if it is F, is to ask yourself, you know, is it really derailing and is it sort of critiquing, or is everybody just fine?
Okay, great. And then how do candidates figure out if their future boss will be a good manager for their style?
I think it's the questions you ask in the interview. So I think if you are someone who has a preference for, let's say, we've talked about NTs. So you have NTs. You know, I like really a lot of really challenging, complex projects. I like to, you know, if we're doing things in a certain way, I kind of like to look at, is there a different way, a better way? Can we, you know, if it ain't broke, break it? Is there some other way we can do this that would be better or more, you know, cutting edge? And how is that for you as a manager or leader? I think just, you know, asking questions of the leader style, and if you can teach your students the language of type, then they can start to interpret what they hear. So if they hear someone say, you know, I'm a person who really trusts proven techniques, and so if you're going to come in with something new, I really want to make sure that you have done a lot of research behind it and that you have dotted your I's and crossed your T's. And if we're going to change, there better be a good reason. Then that you could interpret and say, okay, that's an ST manager who's not opposed to change, but wants to make sure that change is presented with a lot of research and specificity. And so if you can teach your students to use the language of type to interpret the questions, I think that will help them figure out the style of their manager or leader.
Do we have time for one more question, Patrick?
Yeah, I think we can take one more. Yep.
Okay. How do you recommend giving examples of competence to young people who don't have much experience to draw upon?
Can you repeat the question again? Sorry.
How do you recommend giving examples of competence to young people who don't have much experience to draw upon?
Oh, how to help them build their confidence? Is that what it is?
No, give examples of competence to young people.
To young people that don't have much experience to draw on. So I guess I'm trying to figure out if it's how to help them.
Does the question relate to competence or confidence?
Competence.
C-O-M-P.
Yes.
Competence. So you're trying to help a student who doesn't have a lot of experience, but you're trying to generate their feelings of confidence.
And they also have in parentheses, say the NT as you suggested.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I guess if I understand the question properly, I guess what I'd want to do with the student is there are a lot of different ways that competence gets demonstrated. Even if they're really young, like my 16 and 15-year-old niece and nephew were visiting a couple weeks ago, and even though they haven't had jobs, they have had a lot of experience in terms of being involved in sports and the roles they've taken on in sports and how they approach sports. So my NT niece really approaches sports very competitively. She wants to be at the lead of the pack. She wants to be the absolute best in her role. My NF nephew, who played soccer, really likes soccer for the relational element and the friendships he built. So even in activities like sports or their extracurricular activities, you can help them see where there are examples of their type at work quite naturally. All right?
Thanks, Patrick.
Okay. Thanks for your questions. Those were great. So let's move on and let's take it up a notch here. And we're going to start to look at type dynamics. So there's a lot you can do with just these 8 preferences and with the function pairs to help students with stress. But we want to take a look at type dynamics. And there's something I want to say, and for those of you that have heard me in workshops before, you've heard me say this before, but one of the things I think about type that we have to be careful of as type professionals is type can get really complicated really fast. I mentioned that about stress earlier. It's true with type in general, but stress in particular. And so when you're working with students, I think a really good place to start is just getting them super oriented to these 8 letters. And if that's where you stop with them, they'll have lots of good information that they can use to reflect back on activities that they've been involved in and how to map those back to type preferences to use when they're interviewing and when they're hearing someone speaking, how they can map it back to type preferences. So there's a lot of real value in those 8 letters, and if you stop there, you'll do really great work. Function pairs is awesome, and the type dynamics provides a whole different level of awareness about type and some different techniques we can use with stress. So what type dynamics says is that we have the 4 functions of S, M, T, and F inside of us, every single person. And for each of the 16 types, those 4 functions are arranged in a certain order. And one of them is called your dominant function. And so one of your 2 middle letters will be your dominant function. It's usually the lead part of your personality. It's the thing you do most naturally, most automatically. Sometimes it's your favorite part of your personality. The other of your 2 middle letters will be your auxiliary function. And your auxiliary is there for balance and support to the dominant function, so that your dominant and auxiliary together give you ways of taking in information and making decisions. And then the other 2 functions that are not part of your type, one of those will be called your tertiary, which is what it sounds like. It's your 3rd favorite. And then the last one that is not in your 4-letter, part of your 2 middle letters, is called your inferior function. And your inferior function tends to be your least favorite, least natural. Sometimes people refer to it as their Achilles heel, the thing that they're prone to overlooking. And if you've been through a certification program, you have gone through the rigors of how to figure this out, but there is an easier way to figure out type dynamics, and that's if you get out your introduction to type booklet if you ever want to talk about type dynamics. For every type at the very top there in that little light purple box, it tells you what the dominant function is, what the auxiliary is, the tertiary, and the inferior. Now, the dominant function really affects what's most important to us and also what can trigger stress in each of us. So let's take a look at these. Common stress triggers for dominant sensing types. So these are those of you that have preferences for ESTP, ESFP, ISTJ, and ISFJ. For all 4 of these types, they're drawn to specifics and experience in the moment. So what can cause stress in them is when you don't have enough sensing. So When there's a lack of information, that can be very stressful for sensing types, or a lack of activity can be very stressful. Or conversely, if you do too much of your inferior function, which for these types is intuition, so dealing with the unknown or having to guess about the future. One of my best friends in San Diego has preferences for ESFP. And ESFPs tend to be very active types. They tend to be very much in the moment with people they care about. And when she, a few years ago, had a life event that was causing her to think a lot about the future, it really, really stressed her out because she does, it's not that she doesn't ever think about the future, but her favorite place to be is really in the present. And in fact, she has said to me, I don't really think about the past very much. I don't think about the future too much. I live in the present. So if you think about someone who's really drawn to being in the present, being with the reality of what is, not having enough of that or having to flip into the unknown can be really stressful. Okay, for dominant intuition types, these are ENTPs, ENFPs, INTJs, and INFJs. All four of these dominant intuition types are really drawn to brainstorming, making things bigger, making connections, seeing patterns, either externally or internally. So when you don't get enough of that, so when there's constraints on brainstorming or there's constraints on visioning or too many rules, that can be frustrating and stressful for dominant and intuition types. Too much sensing. Sensing is the inferior function for dominant intuitive types. So when you're dealing with a lot of details or having to focus too long on the present or past, that can be really stressful because dominant Ns like to go kind of jump into the future of what doesn't exist, what could be. So having to focus too much on what is or what has been can be very stressful. Okay, for those of you that have dominant thinking, so ESTJs, ENTJs, ISTPs, or INTPs, all of these four types are drawn to bringing logical order to their worlds. If you are extroverted and you're dominant thinking, it's usually bringing logical order to your outer world. And if you are dominant introverted thinking, it's usually bringing logical order to your inner world. So if you don't get enough of that, where things are not logical or not orderly, this can be very stressful. This is where dominant thinking types start to say things like, this is so stupid. And those are words that dominant thinking types use when there's not enough logical order to things. Or conversely, their inferior function is feeling. So if they're having to be involved in feeling decision-making, dealing too long with other people's personal reactions, this can be really stressful for them. So if you remember earlier, we went through the 8 preferences, and each of the, if you're an extrovert and you're spending a lot of time introverting, now we get really specific into what your dominant function is, and there are certain things that can really trigger your type based on your dominant function. Okay, for dominant feeling types, ESFJs, ENFJs, ISFPs, and INFPs, the draw of that personality is to creating harmony, either outer or inner. And so when you don't have enough of that, if there are situations that conflict with your values or with relationships, can be quite stressful, or if there's too much thinking where you're involved in personal decision-making, win-lose decisions where not everybody can win-win, can be very stressful for dominant feeling types. So how this works kind of conceptually is when we're not stressed, to go back to kind of the unstressed state, is we've got lots of conscious energy up here to give to our dominant and auxiliary. So you've got those 2 middle letters that are working side by side so that you've got ways of taking things in and figuring them out. And you also have enough energy to give to your tertiary and inferior functions. So you're kind of using all 4 of your functions as you need to or want to. And then what happens is you get stressed out. And when you get stressed out, one of the first things you can do is start to overuse your dominant. And the problem with that is you become a little lopsided. Okay, so for those of you that are dominant sensing types, we talked about that earlier. That's your ESTP, ESFP, ISTJ, ISFJ, for those of you that have those types. Overusing your dominant is over-focusing on details or over-focusing on activities and not really doing anything with the details or activity. If you're dominant N, these are ENTPs, ENFPs, INTJs, INFJs. You can start to over-swirl with possibilities. So, we could do this, we could do this, there's a connection here, there's a connection here, but nothing actually getting done with any of those possibilities or connections. If you're a dominant T, that's those of you that are ESTJs, ENTJs, ISTP, or INTPs, you start to overdo that dominant thinking, which is overdoing logic. So, here's the logical way to get things done. Here's the logical way, either internally or externally. And it's not being informed by new information or new possibilities. It's just all focused on logical decision making. And those of you that are dominant Fs, so that would be ESFJs, ENFJs, ISFPs, or INFPs, you start to overdo feelings. So it's kind of overdoing harmony. So just tell me what you want. Here's what will make you happy. It doesn't matter, just whatever will make you happy. This is what will make me happy. What will make me happy? Overdoing feeling, and again, not informing it with new information from sensing or new possibilities from N. It's just all F. And sometimes this is where it ends, by the way. You overdo your dominance. You say, well, this isn't working, and you kind of go back to normal. But what happens a lot is we can go into being in the grip. And this is called in the grip of your inferior function. And the reason we call it that is because when you are not stressed, you use your inferior function all the time. You use all parts of yourself as you need to or want to. But when you're under stress, what happens is there's an eruption of your inferior function from the unconscious, accompanied by its friend tertiary, by the way. So there's your two least favorite parts of yourself from flying out of you. And your dominant auxiliary have kind of evaporated over here. And so we call it being in the grip because all of a sudden your inferior function really has you in its grip. It is really using you. You're not using it. What I've seen is sometimes people skip that step of overdoing their dominant function and fly right into the grip. So you can kind of watch what happens for you and for others around you. Now, there are some warning signs, and this is really, I found this tremendously personally useful, is to look at the warning signs in myself or in others that the grip is coming on or that I'm actually in it. And so for dominant sensing types, what can happen is you start to flip into your inferior intuition by exaggerating and losing control of details. Okay? This happened to me actually this was in February, and my partner has preferences for ISTJ. And he lives in Charlotte. I was doing a workshop in Charlotte. And the weather, I don't know if you remember this, but they had this horrible storm that happened in February. And I was there during this Snowmageddon event. And he was supposed to be meeting me somewhere, but he got sent home early from work because the roads were so bad. And there was just a lot of complications of trying to get together. And so when I called him, normally ISTJs are very solid and steady, but on the phone, because he was so stressed out from the driving and he couldn't really control, there was a lot of unknowns about what the roads were like, is when he called me, he said, I am never going to get home. So this is where ISTJs start to use this exaggeration of never and ever. And then he said, I have spun out twice already. And I thought, I'm pretty sure you haven't spun out. I'm pretty sure your car probably fishtailed, but if you spun out, we probably wouldn't be on the phone right now. But for him, it was very real, and that's a very good example of it. It's flipping into exaggerating and losing control. For dominant intuition types, they kind of do the opposite. They flip into that inferior sensing, and they over-focus on details, and they lose sight of possibilities. For dominant thinking types, they flip into their inferior feeling and become very emotional and lose access to logic. So For dominant thinking types, it's actually it's disorienting for all of us. But for dominant thinking types who are so used to kind of having it together and being logical, to have these emotional reactions can be very, very upsetting. And for dominant feeling types, they flip into their inferior T by becoming what they call snarky and losing concern for harmony. I saw this a year ago in myself, where I was in the process of, I just sold a house. I was renting an apartment while I was looking for a house. The housing market in San Diego had gone crazy right at the time that I was trying to buy a year ago. I had put an offer on a house. It was a lot of conflict in the negotiation of the house. So I was in the grip. And at that moment, at that period of time, I decided I needed to buy a new clicker, for my slides when I'm doing presentations, because I had this client in Michigan, this auto company, that used an LCD TV for projecting your slides, and a regular clicker with a red laser didn't work, because I discovered that these TVs absorb the red laser, and so I needed a green laser. Well, I bought a green laser like a couple of years ago, and it was great. And I had left the USB portion in a computer in Chicago when I was doing a workshop, and so now I couldn't use my green laser pointer. And I needed a new one because, of course, the company in Michigan called. As soon as I lost the USB port, they called and wanted me to come back and do another workshop. So now I've got a lot going on. I'm not in a good place. I'm now ticked off that I don't have my clicker, and that clicker was, fairly expensive. So I go to Office Depot, and I walked in and I asked the guy. I said, "Where are your clickers?" And I was not particularly friendly because I was in my snarky thinking mode. And he said, "Oh, you mean the remote presenter?" And I looked at him and I said, "No one calls them remote presenters but you. They're called clickers." Yeah, that is exactly what I said. Of all my choices, this is what I said. And so then he walks me over to this, aisle and points. And, of course, they all say remote presenter, so he was 100% correct. But, I walked out of that Office Depot, and I thought, thinking about type, and I thought, really, like of all my options, that was the best one I could come up with. And so I just thought, you know what? I probably, A, need to stay away from people, and B, I probably need to figure out, like, what I can do here to try to minimize some of the stress, because I'm just not being very effective in my life. So these are really, really useful things for people to have a hold of. I want to give you an example of another ENFJ, actually, and this was, I mentioned my friend's daughter who's at San Diego State. Her roommate has preferences for ENFJ, and she gave this great example of ENFJ in the grip. And what she said is that the situation for her was that she saw her boyfriend's cell phone. He was sleeping. She saw his cell phone, and a text came up from another girl. And this started to kind of really get her stressed out. And so for her, she started to overdo the feeling. She talked about saying, I need to figure out my relationship. Okay? And her intuition is in there going, I need to figure it out. So intuition is, what does this mean? But then she said she just went to, I need to figure out my relationship. And ways of doing through intuition are getting smaller and smaller. I need to figure this out. And by the way, her F said, but I can't wake him up because he's sleeping. So her F was just in full throttle relationship, trying to maintain harmony, and she just really was not coming up with too many ways to handle the situation. So what she said she did then is she had an eruption of her thinking function accompanied by its tertiary. So when introverted thinking comes out of an ENFJ, it's not normal introverted thinking. Normal introverted thinking is bringing logic to the inner world. It comes up all twisted out of an ENFJ, and it comes out as being really harsh and really critical. And then the sensing comes out also, it's a little friend tertiary there, comes out as really twisted up sensing. So it's kind of focusing on one thing, being pretty myopic. And so what she said, and these were her words, she said, I found myself, I got aggressively into bed. So her boyfriend is sleeping. She doesn't want to wake him up. She said, I got aggressively into bed, which is this introverted thinking, took the covers, moved around a lot so that I woke him up, and then she feigned that she was sleeping. So it's when the T comes out, and it comes out as really, usually ENFJs are pretty nice people. But in the grip, they can turn into these really critical people. And she said, and then she also, when she gets this way, she gets really snappy with others, which is the exact same thing that's introverted thinking. And she said she gets really serious, which is also very introverted thinking because everything is very serious. Just the window. In a few minutes, I'm going to talk about how to get out of the grip, and what she talked about as helping her actually seems to match her type pretty closely. So speaking of reactions, there's some common stress reactions. These are kind of some names that I've assigned to each of the dominant functions. So for dominant sensing types, ESTPs and ESFPs tend to be the exaggerators. They kind of go to doom and gloom. Everything is horrible. And ISTJs and ISFJs become the dramatizers. So that was kind of like my partner spinning out with, things were very dramatic. Dominant intuition types, ENTPs and ESPs, become the obsessors. So they focus on one thing, one piece of information, and that is the only piece of information that's important to them. INTJs and INFJs become the indulgers. So they tend to slip into sensing, and they overindulge in sensing activities, overeating, overwatching reruns of old television shows, over shopping online, over cleaning. Dominant thinking types, ESTJs and ENTJs, become the martyrs. So usually they're in T mode, very logical, but when they flip into their inferior feeling, they become very unloved. Why don't people care about me? ISTPs, INTPs become the emoters, so they tend to have these very extreme outward emotional reactions. Dominant feeling types, ESFJs and ENFJs, we talked about the condemners. Everyone around them is, who are these idiots and why am I an idiot? And everyone around them has got something wrong with them when they're stressed out. And ISFJs and INFPs become the criticizers. They become critical of themselves and also of others. All right, so helping people through stress. So there are some ways that we can actually help different types through stress. And for dominant extroverted sensing types, our ESTPs and ESFPs, we just really want to listen, give them space, let them resolve the problem. Usually ESTPs and ESFPs love you to be engaged and really active with them. When they're stressed out, we actually just need to listen and give space. And don't tell them how to fix it. In fact, today when we finish the webinar, I'm having coffee with an ESFP friend who's had a lot of difficulty in her life in the last couple months. And so I am paying attention to this slide here and just going to go. I'm going to listen and just let her find her way through. To support stressed ISTJs and ISFJs, also give them space, listen to them, provide affirmation, help them break things into manageable pieces. Okay, so this is what I did with Scott when he was kind of, going into his I've spun out mode. Is I said, well, okay, so how far can you drive until the next exit, so that if you have to get off the next exit, you can get off. So we kind of, took things in baby steps. Don't brainstorm or give them more to do. That's for sure. Okay, for dominant N types, INTJs and INFJs, give them space, let them express their thoughts or feelings. They're going to have this need to really actually talk about what's going on with them. Don't give advice. ENTPs and ENFPs, give them space. A lot of people need space, as you can see. Remind them that they're able and competent. In that moment, they are not really remembering that. And give them permission to escape. This is where ENTPs and ENFPs, usually very gregarious and love to play and be around people, just evaporate. And that's exactly what they need to do. And they need to feel okay when they're doing it. Don't give unsolicited advice or ask for details. If they ask for it, it's fine. And whatever you do, don't get too specific because they're already over-focusing on details. For thinking types, ESTJs and ENTJs, Listen, let them talk it out, discuss information or ideas that could lead to solutions. So they actually do want you to kind of talk things out with them. The worst thing you can do is be overly sympathetic or emotional. They're already feeling overly sympathetic and emotional. So the last thing they need you to do is join. ISTPs and INTPs, give them plenty of alone time and space. Of all the types, ISTPs and INTPs are the ones that just need to go away. I mean, there's really not much you can do. You just really need to leave them alone. And if you can take away some of the responsibilities they have. They always say they appreciate that. And whatever you do, don't ask them how they feel, because they're already they're all bundled up in these very uncharacteristic feelings. So don't ask them how they're feeling. Okay, for F-types, for ESFJs and ENFJs, acknowledge how they feel and let them talk it out. This acknowledgement of how they're feeling tends to be really important. Remind them of their strengths and contributions. Don't use logic to talk them out of it, and don't ignore them. So they're already kind of all bundled up in not great use of T, so more logic isn't going to help. The main thing is just to kind of acknowledge how they feel. And for ISFPs and INFPs, you want to validate their feelings, and you want to remind them of their strengths and qualities, because ISFPs and INFPs just really get very hard on themselves. What happens with them is they have this thinking reaction that can be really harsh, and then they feel horrible that they just have this horrible thinking reaction. So they kind of take it out on themselves. So just really remind them of how great they are and offer to help. Don't give advice or try to fix, but offer to help if they need it. So making practical use of this, I always say the first thing to do is just to really monitor and be aware of your own reactions to stress. What triggers it for you? What happens? What do you need to get back to equilibrium? Does it match what type theory suggests? So really watching your own stress reactions. When your students know about their types, discuss how they can use type to manage stress. And today you have all these different levels that you can use to talk about type and stress. This is really important too, is encourage people to express what they need when they're stressed, but preferably before it happens, and if possible, when it happens. And then ask others what they need. So this is one of the things that is amazing to me when I do my stress workshops, is that we kind of expect people to know, what they need to do, the sort of the perfect, elegant solution to our stress. And people don't know. And as you can see, the different ways to help different types, it's a slippery slope. It's, for one type it's this, for another type it's that. So if people can let their colleagues know, their families know ahead of time, when you see me doing this, this is what's happening, and here's what you should do about it. I had a guy once I trained who's an INFJ. He was one of those that when he got stressed, he overdid sensory activities. So he said he started over cleaning his office, like breaking out the 409 and kind of maniacally, cleaning his office. And his staff used to think it was funny, and they would tease him about it, and that just made things worse. And so once we went through the type workshop, I said, well, now you're doing what your type would suggest you do. And so what you need to do now is go back to your staff and say, look, when you see this happening, it means I'm really stressed, and here's what you shouldn't do, and here's some good things to do. Practice giving others what they need during stressful events. I really do try to use this. And for the people in my life whose types I know, I do really try to think about when they're under stress, what really is the best way to support them. I have to go back to the information quite often, and take a look at the little tips, but practice giving others what they need. And then after a stress event occurs, try debriefing it with students from a type lens. And what new learning can they gain from the event? At the very beginning of the workshop, when we talked about can you avoid stress reaction, type says you can't. There's always information from the unconscious trying to get through to us, and oftentimes it comes through us through a stress reaction. So once you or one of your students has had a stress event and you're on the other side of it, try to go back and say, what was kind of the message behind the event that was trying to get through to me? Your students and yourselves can get some pretty powerful learning out of that. Okay, resources. In the grip, this is the great sort of quintessential resource on type and stress. Naomi Klink also wrote, "Was that really me?" if you want to read more about type under stress and for people that are chronically in the grip. There's a stress management report that CPP produces. I do workshops on type and stress if you have any interest in those. And so now I will turn it over to Anjane, who will take it from here.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. This is just a reminder to connect with us online. As you can see, we're on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest, and Instagram. So make sure you follow us to keep up with the latest news, tips, and advice from our team of experts. And we're also running a promotion for our webinar attendees. So if you spend $350 or more, you'll receive a free TypeHead mug with a $25 Amazon gift card. So make sure you use promo code April2014, and the offer expires Friday, May 2nd. And just as a reminder, this is not valid on previous purchases with other promotional offers or on international orders. And it's only one mug per customer. So please note that when you place your order, you'll also receive the mug and gift card separately when your purchases are shipped. So don't fret if you don't receive your mug with your purchases right away. Next slide. If you're an international customer and would like more information on products and services, please go to www.cdp.com/global sales. And if you haven't done so already, please check your email preferences by visiting www.cdp.com/emailpref. Many of you guys don't receive our webinar invitations or follow-up emails because you're unsubscribed in our system. So please be sure to update your preferences. And this webinar is eligible for 1.5 NBCC approved CE clock hours as well as MBTI Master Practitioner credits. All certificate requests will incur a $7.95 plus tax and processing fee. In order to qualify to purchase a certificate, you must meet the eligibility requirements as noted on the screen. To be eligible, our system must show that you attended this webinar for 1 hour or longer. The system will automatically track attendees by email and screen viewing time. If you are calling in and not viewing this on our screen, you are not eligible as our system does not track phone calls. Okay, so we have about 5 more minutes for some additional questions. So Patrick, I have 2 to ask you.
Okay.
MBTI preferences are innate and continue to develop. Stress has 2 components of resilience and emotional control, which are learned behaviors. What are your thoughts regarding most students dealing with stress, depending on their current stage of development?
Yeah, so what I found with type and stress is that when I showed that slide earlier of the conscious and the unconscious and how the tertiary and inferior are sort of lower or deeper into the unconscious, what I found that as people go through type development is that, well, let me give you sort of an image for that. I always view the tertiary and the inferior functions as being on rubber bands in the unconscious. So the less developed they are, meaning the less attention we have given them or the less experience we have with them, the further down they are in the unconscious, which means that when they erupt as a stress reaction, they have a lot more trajectory. And the more developed the tertiary and inferior are, the less trajectory they have. So I think what you will find, you can't nudge someone down their developmental path. This is always the big challenge when working with students is, you might have all this wisdom and there's wisdom out in the world, but everyone is on their own developmental path at their own speed. And so what you may find is for many students, their stress reactions may be really severe. If you think about the ones that, when you were in your 20s, for those of you that are older than being in your 20s, if you think about those that you had early in your life, many times they were very extreme, and then people often describe later in life their stress reactions are less extreme. So I don't know there's any way to mitigate that because, again, we can't sort of shove someone down the developmental path. These stress reactions are kind of part of the developmental path for people to get in touch with their tertiary and inferior functions. I think we've got time for one more question.
And this one should be quick. So you mentioned one activity to do the heavy lifting in identifying best fit type. Do you have any other examples of resources for finding activities that will be helpful in group interpretation with college freshmen?
Boy, there's so many resources out there. One of the ones, one I used a lot when I first started using type, and I used this for my career planning classes as well as my team buildings, was a booklet that CPP, or a book or a binder that CPP produces. Let me look in my shelf here. Using the MBTI tool in organizations, and despite the organizational title, it had lots of different activities you could use. Another one that I used a lot in the very beginning was called Shape Up Your Program, and that one has lots of really good sort of foundational activities that I think would be really, really useful for college students. So those would be two that I think would be quite good.
Okay, great. Do we have time for one more, Patrick, or you
Sure, one more. Yep.
This was a question that was received when you first were accepting questions about the pre-interview jitters.
Yes.
So do you think that could apply to other activities besides interviewing?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so when I talk about the pre-interview jitters, I was using interviewing as an example, but this can apply to any sort of event that we're engaging in that kind of stresses us out a little bit. And a really good example I have that was really recent is I was up in Canada doing the MBTI certification program here and in the U.S. and in Canada. And there was someone observing my program because she was going to start delivering the certification program. Super competent, super skilled, like incredible person, ESFJ. And as she started going through, and she was, after viewing my program, the following Monday she was doing her first one solo. So as the week went on, she was getting more and more anxious. And I really did use the stuff that is in there with the pre-interview jitters in terms of reminding her of all the information that she did know. She had this incredible binder that she put together with these great notes. I mean, it was so solid. So I reminded her she had information at her fingertips, that she had used type to help people before, and she had really specific kinds of information that were really helpful for people. And I tried to really think about the kind of support that I could offer to her. So the stuff on the pre-interview jitters you can apply to a lot of different things. You can apply it to your own life anytime you take on something that kind of makes you feel that level of discomfort.
Okay, great. Thanks, Patrick. So unfortunately, we are all out of time for today, but we thank all of you for taking the time out of your busy day to attend and for asking so many excellent questions. And thank you, Patrick, for being with us to share your knowledge and expertise.
Thank you.
I want you guys to save the date for May 29th as we're planning to host another Ask an Expert webinar. We are currently working on the topic and will notify all of you as soon as we have it worked out. Remember to check out cdp.com/askanexpert to find all upcoming as well as previously recorded webinars. Thank you all for attending and have a wonderful day.